information and very much working there as a senior research associate. So it's a pleasure to be here. And in order to start, I'll start by already going straight to the point, because this is a discussion I know that's particularly important for Guyana right now. So Guyana has found new sources of oil, and there's a strong debate inside the country. I'm not a specialist on Guyana, but I have been talking a lot with my colleagues from there, Dennis Pyle and Professor Thomas Singh, about the question on the commodity boom that's going on. So when we have a commodity boom, usually we have the reaction from the society is very positive. So we discover a new source of oil, and that would bring a lot of new resources. Right immediately, the next step is for everyone to talk about problems such as Dutch disease and any other possibilities that could emerge from this discovery of this specific natural resource. So the discussion here that I would like to put is, well, is commodity boom a blessing, or is this commodity boom a curse? I will not give a very precise, ultra precise question answer, but as every economist, things depend on circumstances and on different kinds of elements. But instead of just answering it depends, I'll try to present a framework, trying to create a diagnostic on what kinds of depends we are talking about. So here I just start by showing you data for the Observatory of Economic Complexity. And because you will have the seminar with Professor Ricardo Hausmann very soon, so I think that kind of introduces the topic to his discussion, in which we see the exports of two different countries. And those two countries, these are the exports are for last year. And actually what we see is that in the 1970s, when there was the first and the second oil crisis and oil prices started going really up, the United Arab Emirates and Venezuela were mainly in the same particular situation. So they both had their sources of oil, and the increase in prices started creating opportunities. And those opportunities would impact directly the balance of payments of those economies that would allow them to start perhaps a development process. However, what we've seen is that those two countries took very different patterns after this initial shocks. So while Venezuela intensified its specialization pattern on the extraction of crude oil, you see 61% of the exports are mainly crude oil. The United Arab Emirates started not only a policy, but in terms of its institutional capacity and etc., to move towards a process of diversification of its economy. So on one hand, while Venezuela, the oil discoveries tended to foster the process of specialization, the United Arab Emirates, in which we can see cities such as Dubai or Abu Dhabi, became a hub, not only on the extraction of oil, but based on extraction of oil, they develop a hub in manufacturing and also in services. And it is a quite diversified economy and much less fragile than it was before. So in this sense, for the United Arab Emirates, we can perhaps argue that the commodity boom was a blessing. Meanwhile, for Venezuela, as we see the current situation with the Venezuelan economy, which is probably the most unstable economy in the Latin American and the Caribbean region, it's creating a pattern of further fragility. So what I want to explain is what are the conditions for these problems that could face countries and put them trapped into some development issues. So let me enumerate some challenges that lead to some development traps that take some countries, and countries in the Latin America and in the Caribbean are usually very much facing those, or at least part of those issues. So first, we can discuss about economic specialization in the production and exports of products with low value add. So we extract natural resources, we don't manufacture them, we just export them as they are. And there are many problems related to that. The first one is when you put all your basket into the extraction and export of one specific product, that product is especially a natural resource, which is quite volatile in its terms of its price, of international market prices. It creates a lot of volatility on the balance of payments of those economies, and ends up creating a lot of periods of booms and bursts. A lot of crises come up emerging and a lot of instability. Another second issue is the discussion on premature deindustrialization, because what we see in many countries and now I'm going to talk in the Latin American and the Caribbean region most of the time, we see that while countries such as the US, the UK, Japan, managed to achieve a very mature level of industrialization before starting to deindustrialize, or before starting to increase its share of services in total GDP, in total value added, in total employment, Latin America has been going in a very weird direction. Some countries managed to industrialize themselves in the 60s, in the 70s, and then since the mid-70s and the 80s, those countries kind of stagnated in terms of their productive structure, and there has been more recently a strong process of deindustrialization. So before reaching any level of maturity in its industrial structure that could internalize and endogenize the process of technological change, those countries reached a limit and started deindustrializing. So it's a problem that we've been looking at right now. Another problem is the lack of mechanisms of incentives that stimulate economic diversification. And on that, we can name Dutch disease, but not only Dutch disease, many other elements related to the lack of technological capabilities, to the immatureness of the national innovation system, to institutional elements. So all of those lack of endogenous mechanism, political economy, which can, so we could go on and listing many other elements. And the lack of technological capabilities and learning conditions that could mainly make technological change endogenous on those economies. So that would increase the quality of goods produced and would allow those economies to learn and adapt from the technologies that are being produced abroad. Instead of that, there's no learning, it's just the import of consumption goods, perhaps some inputs, intermediary inputs, but the process of learning that could generate put those countries in the international race for technological change is not happening. So this is something that needs to be taken into account. Some other elements, the first of another one is related to, as we discussed, Professor Singh mentioned about the works of Raoul Prebisch. Prebisch is very well known for his theory on center periphery, in which the center is the locus of technological change and the periphery absorbs it. But in the end, it ends up in specializing its structure on the exports of natural resource of low-tech products, while it imports mainly manufacturing goods. And the structure of the developing world, or the peripheral economies, suffers a very high technological gap in comparison to the forefront. And it's not only a technological gap, but a strong process of heterogeneity. While the process of creative destruction is very strong in the developed world, in the developing world, we see many different waves of industrial patterns coexist. We see cars from the 40s, cars from the 50s, cars from the 60s. Well, they are still on the street, and I'm originally from Brazil, so it's quite common to see someone in a horse, like in the countryside of not only the countryside, but in the urban areas, the smaller urban areas of Brazil. So you see that the modern and the traditional very much coexist, and different layers of moderns are still coexisting. So there's a lot of heterogeneity. And the second role, the central role of the external sector, which is something that I will talk a lot in this presentation, in defining the possibilities of economic development. Because in the end of the day, the peripheral world, developing economies, they're not able to supply US dollars or euros or currencies that are accepted internationally to make transactions. So what do they have to do? They need to acquire those foreign currencies by exports or attracting financial flows. If you end up reaching a situation in which you cannot attract more international currency or foreign currency anymore, you enter into a balance of payments constraints, which is a very strong problem that has happened into Latin America and the Caribbean many, many times. in many decades. 1980s, we had the problem in the mid 1990s. So we see that this is a process that repeats itself. Another issue is commodity price volatility, because commodity prices are on average much more volatile than manufacturing prices in international in the international market. And the instability of financial flows, as for instance, we've seen the process of increases in interest rates from the Fed and the European Central Bank. And when basic interest rates start rising, they start attracting the capitals back to the countries that were before, so the central economies. And that ends up resulting in a lot of instability from the developing world, because all the currency that was distributed around the world comes back to the core and creates problems in terms of exchange rate, of the financial flows management, monetary management, etc. And finally, something that I've been discussing a lot, and is the income elasticity of imports and exports defining the long-term economic growth rate. I'll talk a lot about income elasticity of exports and imports. The idea is, I'm going to talk about this in a bit, but just to summarize, when the world gets richer, people tend to consume more manufacturing goods rather than basic commodities. When I increase my income, I'm not going to eat the 2 times of the rice or bread that I consume, but I would like to buy a car, or perhaps buy a new phone or a computer or something like that. So the idea comes very much from the product characteristics in terms of income elasticity, and countries that are managed to diversify and produce high-tech goods that has a higher ratio on the elasticity between exports and imports, make the economies more resistant, more resilient to international shocks. And I'm going to talk about this in a bit. I went very fast, but I can repeat it, and we can discuss that in the discussion session. So I'm going to start by talking about volatility. I'll talk about structures and balance of payments constraints, and then show a more general framework about that. So first, in order to illustrate about volatility, I'm going to talk about GDP growth volatility. So volatility is mainly the standard deviation of a time series, so we can see it like that here, and the standard deviation of countries such as in the developed world tend to be much less volatile, much less steep, oscillate much less than in the developing world. And here I show the data for Norway, comparing it with Guyana, which are 2 countries. Guyana has 1 million population, Norway has 4 million, so it's not like we're talking about China and Guyana. So let's try something in kind of related. And Norway is also export a lot of natural resources, but it managed to upgrade technologically its export. So we're going to talk that in a bit. But what we see is that it's quite clear that Norway, the gray line, oscillates much less than Guyana. And this is true when we took Guyana, when it took Brazil, when we take Argentina, when we take Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Trinidad, so any country either in the Caribbean region or in the rest of Latin America. So what is the problem with that? Why are we talking about this? Because volatility is a problem per se. If it's the result of some conditions, and I'm going to argue that some structural conditions of the economy, it also really affect those economies back. So then what volatility can generate and create of problems for us? What's the channels in which volatility affect our economies? So first of all, if we go back to Keynes and think about the role of investment as capital accumulation, and which makes our economies mainly grow, investments depend on the degree of certainty that investors will take in the future, trying to bring the perspective that they have of their profitability to present value. And this present value is mediated by an interest rate, by deflationary interest rate. And this interest rate is based on expectations. It's based on the expectations of the capitalists, the investors that are going to make the investment decision. The thing is, in volatility increases uncertainty. So we are in a more uncertain world, So it only makes sense for me to make an investment if actually I foresee that my profitability will be high enough to compensate for this uncertainty. So the higher the uncertainty, the higher the risk, the opportunity cost to make an investment. So investment projects become less interesting in a very uncertain environment and reducing marginal capital efficiency. So you see countries that are suffering a lot of instability. Let's get examples that are extreme. We can talk about Syria, which is going through a war. So people are not going to make investments in a place that's going to such an instability. Or even countries that are going to a political instability that may not lead to a war, but leads to something that is so uncertain that it's basically, instead of attracting any kind of foreign capital or make domestic investments, it ends up repealing them. So uncertainty is a main problem. Another problem of volatility is the instability in terms of the external accounts. So if you want to have a catching up strategy that makes the structure of an economy, like instead of following a pattern of Venezuela, you try to follow a pattern of the United Arab Emirates. I'm just putting those as examples, perhaps not the best example, but just illustrate. You need to give a catching up strategy. So you need to have your economic conditions to get closer to the technology, to the world's technology frontier. And if you go to the United Arab Emirates, you're going to realize that it's quite modern. It managed to modernize its structure, its financial sector, even manufacturing. So this is the thing that they managed to do, a catch-up strategy. But volatility, it creates a lot of uncertainty, even for catch-up. So it makes it harder to reach that point. So exogenous price volatility has also effects on the real exchange rate of a country. So this strong oscillation, it raises even further uncertainty. And with a lot of uncertainty in the interest rate, it's very hard to, for instance, buy capital goods, which is fundamental to modernize your structure. So it's very hard to get some stable conditions that can guarantee that buying and importing foreign capital goods ends up being something profitable for the investors. Uncertainty also affects consumption. So you have increasing precautionary savings, and when people start consuming less, there is an accumulation of inventories, and those inventories lead to reduction in production. Less production leads to unemployment, leads to people being fired. So when people are fired, then it creates a kind of a snowball, because more unemployment is less consumption. Is not only less consumption, but even less savings. So the savings that could become investments are also cut during this process. So it can create a negative spiral. So that's another problem. And what we're seeing right now, and based in the UK, and this is something that could be even used for the case of the UK, volatility, also this uncertainty, increase the defenses by firms protecting their markups. So some firms we see we're in the middle of a crisis and cost of living crisis, and still the firms are making a lot of profits. So they're increasing the profitability a lot. So why is that? Because they're protecting the market share. They are trying to increasing prices to protect it, so they can protect from competition. And in the end of the day, what you have is that this creates a lot of problems for the population that are living there. And foreign investment leading to reduction in productivity, because it's something that I'm going to argue right now. Learning by doing is a central mechanism of increases in productivity. So you only do better when you do more. You need to be active, you need to make investments, you need to do R&D, you need to, in order to learn. And the more you learn, the more you can, it's like a process of learning to learn. You learn to learn, and when you learn, you can apply. And when you apply, you can advance. And this is how the spiral of evolutionary process of technological change occur. So when we have fallen investments, is a fall on the learning possibilities and a reduction in productivity, or at least in reduction in the growth rate of productivity. And stability is a requirement to learning, because the Center for Innovation process, we have a lot of examples. I'm going to give you an example in Brazil. There was a project called Science Without Borders that they were sending a lot of PhDs and master students abroad to the top institutions in the world to learn, to train them as engineers, as medical doctors, as lawyers, as economists, bring them back. The thing is, in the middle of this process, there was a strong economic crisis so the program ran out of funding. So even the people that were there during the process, they needed to find alternative sources of funding to finish their studies, and they ended up not closing the program. So you see this volatility that could generate this process of advancing ended up creating barriers. So you started and then you ended up what we're going to talk about in terms of chicken flights. You start flying and then you go down. So this another problem during this volatility problem that can lead to processes of hysteresis. So what is the process of hysteresis? You have the cycle going on, but the cycle, as it goes on, it affects the structural conditions of the economy. So when the cycle keeps going on and you have a steep cycle, you may, for instance, even drive your economy even further to specialization in low-tech products. And that decreases even further the pattern of diversification of your economy and increase volatility even further and put some barriers to the possibilities of growth in the long run. And we're going to talk about that in a bit. So let me talk about the second pillar, which is economic structure. So let's see Guyana in 2020. So this is the structure of Guyana based also in the data from the Observatory of Economic Complexity. And we see on the left exports, on the right imports. So we see that Guyana very much follows the pattern of a developing country in Latin American countries, with the exception of Mexico nowadays, or perhaps some countries in Costa Rica, are still in the pattern that export a lot of basic goods or natural resources and low-tech goods, and the import pattern is quite diversified. So we see that if we sum up the crude petroleum and gold, we have more than 60% of the Guyanan exports, which shows that it's an economy that's specialized, but it needs those resources to consume all the different types of goods that are fundamental for the pattern of consumption, for the pattern of production of its population. So here we see very, very, very clearly the pattern of specialization. And the expectation is that as we grow in the direction of even further oil extraction, this would even rise as the share. And if nothing is done, or if nothing is fought, it could end up in the situation that is closer to Venezuela, instead of trying to use this as a springboard. And now I'm going very far away, but as a springboard to development, as the United Arab Emirates has done. And I think that is something that should be fought, at least should be on the table. What pattern of development do we want to have? It may be very hard to follow a similar situation as they did, but if we don't talk about it, we just put it under the rug, we're going to simply follow the pattern towards total specialization and forget that this could be an opportunity, and an opportunity to improve the quality of life of our population. That's something that's quite important to say. So the destiny of the exports and the origin of the imports are usually, well, most of the US, Canada, North America, and the Caribbean, so Trinidad, Jamaica, Barbados. The destiny is a little bit of Europe. China is not that important as other countries, but its origin, China grows because China exports a lot of intermediary, but also final goods at very cheap prices. But this is just to illustrate the characteristics of Guyana in 2020. And also when we look at the product space, which is basically every dot here is a sector. And when we click on it, and this is just, we'd have to go to the website and show you on the Atlas of Economic Complexity, that is actually the project of Professor Ricardo Hausmann, so he could talk about this a lot. We see that each specific sector is connected to other sectors. What does this mean? These connections means that you are closer, if you're closer in this network to another sector, you're closer in terms of the capabilities that you need to produce another sector. So if you're very strong on rice, those, let me see if I get something that are very close. Like, for instance, let's say that containers and transportations and package of medicaments. You see that they're quite close, which means that the capabilities that you need to produce those two are quite similar. But then you have, for instance, airplanes that are here. It's very hard if you are producing mainly sugarcane and sucrose to move directly to the production of airplanes, because the degree of capabilities that you need is completely different from the capabilities you currently have. And what is the idea of this product space is that in order to diversify, you can do it in terms of smart specialization. They call it smart specialization, but I think it's smart diversification. So you try to diversify to the sectors that are nearby. What is the problem here? The problem is that we see petroleum is a very large dot because it's quite important from Guyana, is a sector that is it's almost an enclave. It's a sector that the capabilities you need to oil extraction are very hard to translate directly to other sectors. So unless there is a strong effort to use those capabilities and try to move towards other sectors, we enter these kind of situations as Venezuela has entered. It's kind of a development track that you keep over-reliant on the sector that you have the capabilities. The macroeconomic structure pushes forward to the exploitation of those resources, and the economy is quite fragile because if in any changes in terms of its prices affects directly the balance of payments of those economies. So this is extremely interesting as an exercise, and I recommend entering the Atlas of Economic Complexity. The quality of the data comes from Comtrade, but the quality of data visualization is very high, so it helps a lot to understand what is going on in the structure of a specific country. So now I'm going to talk very quick, it's still in the realm of economic structure, on income elasticity of demand that I already mentioned before, but I'm going to repeat that. So the idea is the following: as the world increases its income, so we have growth in the world, what kinds of products are people more willing to consume? So we had a period that was quite different from what we have before in the recent economic history of the world. Since China started going very fast in its process of industrialization and urbanization, we've seen that the demand for natural resources has started growing at a much faster pace than for manufacturing goods. This happens during the 2010s, and that's the commodity boom that we saw in the 2010s. China had a central role, and financialization played a central role, but now China is growing at a much lower pace, and since the 2015, 16, and as it started reducing the rate of growth, the price of commodities kind of went down with China. What we're talking about here is more like a medium-term, long-term perspective. As the world keeps getting richer, and richer, we expect that as the world reaches kind of a middle class, people start consuming, as they earn more money, more manufacturing goods instead of just consuming more primary goods. That's the argument, and this argument that's been used by Prebisch, that's been used by many of the new structuralist authors, and the Economics Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean of the United Nations are currently focusing on this a lot. In the previous report that they released last year talks about this and put this in the center of the debate. So when you're in your own country, you have to ask the following question: as the world gets richer, how more willing it is to consume my products? Is the world more willing to consume my products? So I'm producing oil. If things start moving towards renewables, how is the world more willing to consume oil? Is it? But this is something to think in the medium run. It's not happening right now. But in terms of, because it connects directly to the matter of sustainability that I'm going to talk in a bit. And this answer depends on the technology paradigm that we are facing right now. And it looks like with this new discussions on Industry 4.0 that we are starting moving, and this is still the beginning of the process, towards a quite different paradigm that it was before, especially as the challenge of climate change and etc. are driving the process of technological advancements towards sustainable, renewable energy and etc. And the degree of diversification of an economy affects the income elasticity of demand. So low-tech and natural resource products tend to have smaller income elasticity of demand in the long run than the manufacturing high-tech goods. So we go back then to this idea that we are looking at the sectoral composition, defining the pattern of interaction. In the international dynamics. So we're always looking about open economies. There's no closed economy here. We are talking about international dynamics. So we have then 4 dimensions. We have foreign, domestic, but we also have that the economy, it can be divided, and we go back to the works of Sir Arthur Lewis, which is one of the inspirations for us to do this work, one of the most relevant economists in the history of the Caribbean region, dividing the economy between modern and traditional sectors. So we have a modern sector, it could be manufacturing, but it could be services like high-tech services, and we have traditional sector, which could be services, but the low-tech services, informality and etc., and parts of agriculture, because we have also modern agriculture nowadays. So this reshapes a bit the concepts that we have between agriculture and manufacturing. So now we can talk about traditional and modern. So then we discuss the structure. Let's talk about balance of payments constraints. I think I have around 15 minutes, so I'll try to use all my time on that. So the balance of payments constraints is that the idea that a country is constrained by its external condition. And this is particularly true in developing countries. So we have what we call chicken flights pattern. So I've seen a chicken flying, it starts flying, but then it cannot fly like going up. It starts going up and then it falls. So the idea of the chicken flight is that you have that the economy starts growing, and it starts growing at a certain rate, let's say 5%. But then as it grows around 5%, there's a lot of pressures in the direction of imports. Meanwhile, so you're going to import more because you grow more, but then exports do not grow at the same rate because exports do not depend on you, depend on the rest of the world buying from you. So what we see is that as we grow at a certain rate that is above the one compatible with certain stability of the balance of payments, we always reach a foreign crisis. So we end up always reaching a foreign crisis. So that's the big discussion that should be taken into account. So how to make this process of endogenous crisis in terms of external conditions be neutralized in our pattern of development, so we reduce volatility, increase stability, which leads us to a higher possibilities of shaping the structure towards a more advanced, and which has not only effects on the structure per se, on the production, but also in terms of better quality, that job quality, absorbing more of our jobs in the modern sector, improving average wages, improving the minimum wage, and giving, like, we think about production because we think that production is fundamental to guarantee inclusion. So this is a part of the debate that I want to talk for today. And in order to discuss this problem with the balance of payments, we go to a certain specific model that was developed by Sir Anthony Furwell in 1979, who is a professor at the University of Kent, and John McCombie from the University of Cambridge. So this is a model that sustains that countries cannot grow in the long run at a rate that is higher with a certain rate compatible with stability in the balance of payments. So when the growth rate has a higher rate than the compatible with the balance of payments, we have imbalances in the currency account. So and that leads back to the chicken flights. So it leads the economy to an external crisis. And in an even more extreme argument, Jose Antonio Campo, which is now the Ministry of Economics of Colombia and was the Secretary General of ECLAC in the 2000s, he coined the concept of balance of payments dominance, which very much is kind of a parallel with the idea of fiscal dominance. So instead of fiscal dominating, like with the government spending dominating the patterns of growth, it's actually the balance of payments in developing economies that dominate the pattern of growth. So you need to guarantee certain stability in external accounts, otherwise you enter into a crisis. And so just very quick, the derivation of the model is, so we derive a model. I'm not going to go into the specifics of it, but we have an explicit export and an explicit import function, X and M, exports and imports. And exports depend on foreign growth. So when the world grows more, there's a more demand for the exports of my products. let's assume that I'm living in my domestic economy. So when the world grows more, my domestic economy will have more opportunities to sell. So it will increase my export. So let's say that we are talking about Guyana. So when the world grows more, there's more pressure to buy Guyana products. And the real exchange rate plays a role. So the real exchange rate affects the prices of your domestic products in international currency. So when you have a devaluation, it's cheaper for the world to buy your products. When you have appreciation, it's more expensive for the world to buy your products. And you have what we call the price elasticities, which are the elasticities related to the real exchange rate fluctuations, and the income elasticities. The income elasticities are related to the growth, the output fluctuation. So if exports depends on foreign growth, imports depends on domestic growth. So when the economy grows more, the domestic economy is growing, there are pressure for more imports because we don't produce everything we need. So we need to start importing more of our products as we grow. And the real exchange rate operates in a different way. In growth rates, we have that the growth of exports depends on price elasticity multiplied by real exchange rate, and income elasticity of exports multiplied by the foreign growth. Meanwhile, growth of imports depends on the real exchange rate, but in a negative sense, also an appreciation increase imports, and the domestic growth affects the growth of imports. So this is a very simple model, and we have the equilibrium conditions of it. So what's the equilibrium condition is that exports at domestic prices plus the financial flow, so we need to take into consideration portfolio and FDI, because on the capital account, are equal to imports of the country. When we derive the model and we just replace everything here, we end up in a situation in which we can derive the growth rate that is compatible with balance of payments constraints. So we have this ugly equation that mainly says that the balance of payments, the growth rate compatible with my balance of payments in the short run, depends on my real exchange rate, depends on the real exchange rate, depends on foreign growth, domestic growth, and financial flows. That's mainly what affects the growth rate of compatible with balance of payments. In the long run, as neither real exchange rates nor financial flows can be explosive, what we have is that in the long run, the balance of payments constrained growth rate depends on the foreign growth and the ratio of income elasticities of demand. And this ratio of income elasticities is fundamental, because when we model it, we directly connect it to the productive structure of the country. So we say that a country that is more diversified, that's more closely connected to technological change, that has a better national system of innovation, ends up increasing this ratio and are able to grow at a higher rate without reaching an external constraint. So you can grow at a higher rate without entering a foreign crisis. So then that's the idea of the balance of payments constraint model. So it links income elasticities with a pattern of diversification of the productive structure. It's what I'm talking about, this ratio. So a more diversified economy tends to have higher income elasticity, and the growth rate compatible with balance of payments increases. And then this ratio that I showed before is a function of the specialization pattern. So countries that are specialized in goods with higher technological intensity will have a higher ratio. And in the long run, the real exchange rate should be stable. So why I'm saying this? Because I see, and I spoke with Thomas before this presentation, that there is kind of an obsession on discussing Dutch disease, which is an important problem. I'm not disregarding, but it's not the only problem. It's not only Dutch disease that leads you to this kind of development trap. There are other elements that need to be taken into account, and we're going to talk about the system of innovation, the capacity of learning, etc., that we need to consider in order to neutralize these development traps. So in order to do so, and I think I still have 10 minutes, I'll try to use 10 minutes, sorry for that, is the Kaldorian regimes.
No, so please go ahead, Danilo. Go ahead and, take your time to finish your presentation as best you want.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Thomas. Thank you so much. Very kind. So I will explain the Kaldorian regimes then. It's a framework that tries to take everything I've spoken to now into account. So the Kaldorian regimes actually consider that there are three regimes in the economy. The demand regime that considers the effective rate of growth. So the effective rate of growth is the one that we observe, is the one that depends on consumption, investment, government expenditures, is the one that we observe. And the rates restricted by the balance of payments, which is the one that I spoke right now. But also we have a productivity regime in which we need to take into account the supply constraints. So the degree of productivity of the economy and the population can be multiplied by human capital, etc. So we need to guarantee a pattern of convergence of those rates that ends up creating a better pattern for the economy and less volatile. And we're going to have discussing the productivity regime and the structural change regime. I'm going to go very quick for the equations. The idea is that we have three growth rates. So this is based on the paper that I wrote, Professor Gabriel Porcile, which is the director of ECLAC right now in Montevideo in Uruguay, but he was my boss when I was working in ECLAC. And it's based on the works of Professor Mark Satterfield that is on the New School for Social Research, and he's very much focused on the Kaldorian literature. So the idea is that we have three growth rates. So we have one growth rate that's given by the real, the natural rate, the supply, by productivity of our system, and by the growth rate of the population of the economy. And this could be multiplied, as I told you, by human capital and etc. It could enter productivity as well. So, but the idea is that the natural growth rate is the one that sums up the growth of productivity and the growth of population. But we also have a demand rate, which we call the effective rate. The effective rate is the one that considers spending, so it's the demand side, consumption, investment, government that enters this domestic autonomous spending, and trade balance and the balance of payments. So trade balance plus financial flow. So we have the balance of payments here. And we have the third rate, which is the one that I already spoke about, which is the balance of payments constraint rate. So, which in the short run is this ugly equation, but in the long run is the income elasticity ratio multiplied by foreign growth. So we have three growth rates, and we need to guarantee that they adjust. So we have some mechanisms of adjustment. One mechanism is spending. So when the growth rate of the balance of payment is very low, it pushes down the growth rate of effective demand, or the effective growth rate. What does that mean? It means that if we are growing above the rate compatible with balance of payments and we reach a balance of payments crisis, in order for us to adjust, we need to reduce spending. And this is mainly the argument, well, that's going on in terms of austerity. And well, when the IMF goes to many of different developing countries during the 80s and the 90s, it was lending money to those countries, but in those countries needed to start strong austerity measures. So austerity would focus on a reduction in the governmental spending, but also consumption and investment. And the idea here is that you need to reduce absorption, to guarantee the stability. So this is one of the mechanisms. And the second mechanism is the one that puts the natural rate and the effective rate, the demand rate. And this is done mainly through employment. So when the natural rate is very, very high and the demand rate is very low, what we see is a lot of unemployment because there's a lot of idle capacity in the economy. If the demand rate is really high and the natural rate is at a certain level, what we find is full utilization of the factors, and we have full employment with pressures, demand pressures on the economy. So we have these two adjustment mechanisms. And now I'm going to move to the idea that I was talking before on the income ratio of elasticities, which is directly related to the growth rate compatible with balance of payments. So we want to grow, and we want to grow with stability. We don't want to face foreign crises all the time. So what do? We need to improve the income elasticity ratio. How do we do that? Well, we need to guarantee that we have a more diversified economy with a lower technology gap with the center, and that we have efforts to develop a technological learning system related to the national system of innovation of the economies. So it's a system that is able to absorb knowledge and implement, adapt, and dynamically evolve its productive structure. It doesn't mean that, and we're going to talk about catching up in a bit, it doesn't mean that the country needs to redo everything or go back to the first industrial revolution and start burning coal like crazy. The idea is that you can catch up, you can leapfrog, you can go straight from a system that you are not very much advanced in, and I'm talking about sectors. You don't have your sectoral composition quite advanced. It's not only that you're specialized, but in that specialized sector, you're still very far away from the technological frontier, but you can jump because you can import technology from abroad. And if you have the possibilities to learn, then you can implement, adapt, and put it to the scale of your market. That's the idea. In order to do so, you need to take into account the income elasticity of exports, the technology gap, and the domestic efforts on technological learning. So what is the technological gap? It's the difference between the north, the frontier, the cutting edge technologies, and you. And the developing economies. I'm saying you, I'm saying myself, I'm saying like, let's say a developing economy. And what is the problem here? The problem is that we are all continually facing a problem that we call the Red Queen effect. If you've read Lewis Carroll's Alice Through the Looking Glass, which is like, it's another one, it's not Alice in Wonderland, it's another book by Lewis Carroll. He has an argument that says that you need to keep running to be in the same place. Because if you stay, you get like behind. Because the forefront is always running. So this is the Red Queen effect. You keep running, you run after the rabbit, but you need to run to stay in the same place. And that's the problem with technological gap. If you stay, you fall behind. If you run, you can run and stay in the same place, or you can run at a faster pace than the north and catch up. So the technology gap then, it co-evolves with the pattern of specialization of the economy, the employment rate. So in the employment rate is very much connected to what we call the Kaldor-Verdorn effect. So the Kaldor-Verdorn effect is the one in which you need to have activity to learn. You need the economy to be dynamic so you can learn. If you don't have dynamism, you end up being lag behind. And in that sense, the central role of the national innovation system is it enables the economy to grow at the productivity rate and change the standard of specialization of the economy. And there's a lot of work on that. There's not only on the concept of national innovation system, Professor Lundvall, Professor Edquist, but also the application of innovation systems to developing countries. And we have the works of Arocena and Suits and Iozzi and many others. So what is the technology gap then? It's the relationship between North and South. And we have that the North grow at a certain rate and the South can either catch up or fall behind. If the gap reduces, it catches up. If the gap increases, the economy falls behind. Because the North is always moving. So that the frontier is not static, it constantly moves. So the technological opportunities in the South then depends on what I told you before, the national system of innovation, the degree of activity of the economy, and the pattern of diversification. And then we have two ways of modeling this. And I'm gonna give you the argument for an active effort. The idea is that, well, you have a technological distance from the North, which gives opportunities. If you don't have anything and your neighbor has a lot, you can copy, you can get what the person did. You have the opportunities to get closer to the neighbor much faster than if you were by yourself and needed to start from zero. So this means that you can import capital goods that are quite modern. You can develop and try to bring FDI. You can try to create a pattern that goes forward to the technical performance. However, this is not an automatic mechanism. And in the initial, when the economists were conceptualizing this argument, they developed the linear idea. So it's kind of automatic spillovers. It's kind of a convergence argument. The North had gone very fast, but the South will converge because as the spillovers start going south, it trickles down to the South, it starts applying and then it keeps advancing. However, the evidence actually favor a non-linear specification. What does that mean? It means that if you don't have a minimum structure, a minimum system of innovation, a minimum system that learns, you will end up falling behind. So you need to guarantee, and I'm gonna go here very quick, that you do efforts to be able to enter this technological race. So imitation is no means effortless. It's not passive. It's not automatic. It requests significant investments in the Southern economy to absorb this foreign technology. And the international diffusion of technology goes hand in hand with minor innovations and continued investments in R&D and education in order to adapt the foreign technology to the particular conditions. So the idea is that it's not that you're going to basically reproduce the pattern of the North, but you're going to learn and adapt it to your conditions, to your needs, to the societal needs. And that's what is called development by self-supportability, to manage to find the needs of your population and use the possibilities that you have to achieve those needs, instead of just going in a direction that you don't know what it is. And that's why I think it's so important to make these kinds of debates. And we have the nonlinear technological spillovers, which is what I told you before. I'll just present the graph because then it's easier to show. The idea is that you need to reach a certain threshold, a minimum threshold, so the economy can start catching up. If you just rely that the catching up process will be automatic because you absorb the spillover from the North, you actually end up going into a situation of falling behind. Your technological gap keeps increasing because the North will keep moving forward with the technological frontier. So in order for you to absorb that, you need a minimum condition for that. You need what Cohen and Levinthal call absorptive capacity. So if you don't have absorptive capacity of your system, it's a systemic capacity, it's not an individual level. If you don't have this systemic capacity to learn, you end up entering this pattern of falling behind. And finally, I'll go very quick on that, is hysteresis, which is one other problem that is related also to the pattern of volatility that I spoke in the beginning. So the idea is the following: it's much harder to build than it is to lose. It's very hard to build an advanced factory. However, to lose it, just a crisis is enough. COVID could be enough. Any external shock could be enough for you to lose that. So when you're going, and it's very, once you lose those investments, once you either stop doing it in the middle, or you lose you have a crisis, and then all the engineers and the people that have expertise move away from the country, and this has happened in many examples in a region, then it's very hard to recover from it. So when you grow, you can grow well, but when you lose, when you crisis, you're affected much more. So the idea is that there are initial forces that are stronger when the economy is recovering than when the economy is losing capabilities. There's no inertia on that, or at least smaller inertia. So you lose much faster. And that's what generates this pattern. As volatility keeps going on, the diversification, the level technological frontier, the technological frontier of the technological capabilities of the South, or the system of innovation starts going down. So the recurrence of volatility is not neutral. It affects the structural conditions even further. In this sense, what about green transition? Because we're talking about this, I promised Tom we're going to talk about this. I will just mention it. Sorry for that, because there's so many topics. But sustainability is a necessity. It's not something that we can choose. It's a necessity. Science has already more than proved that if we keep going the pace as we are, we're not going to go very far away. So, but it's one thing is to say that it's important. Another thing is to create a framework like the Sustainable Development Goals, which is quite interesting, but it gives goals, it gives targets, but it doesn't show how to reach them. And reaching them is not easy because there are a lot of constraints. So we need to overcome this trade-off between growth and environment, growth and social condition, social development, growth and economic development. Very much in the debate, I mean, in politicians use a lot that we either grow or we, the president of Brazil says that we grow or we burn the Amazon, or we stop burning the Amazon. If you stop burning the Amazon, there's no growth. That's a very silly argument, but it is kind of the mindset, because as we grow, it's indeed true that we need to expand the use of our resources. But the thing is, we need to change how we use those resources, and that's where green transition and sustainability goes. We use them in a different way because we have technological change that can drive some trajectories away from the gray kind of production towards a green pattern of production. But we have problems for developing countries. One is that this transition imply a lot of imports of capital goods that are on the forefront of the new technological revolution. And this major impacts on the balance of payments. And if we enter a balance of payments crisis, how are we going to do that? That's a big question, because it is a problem. It is not a simple solution. And an extra problem too, a second extra problem, is that the transition, it needs investments, which requires stability. So we need to reduce this volatility that we see in our economies. So under strong volatility, the cost of the transition becomes unbearable, and no one will want to make an investment, especially on green technologies or sustainable technologies in that direction. So I think that's what I'm going to say. So just to conclude, we have important challenge to development. So weak structures, volatility, immatureness of the innovation system, external constraints. And is the commodity boom a blessing for development or not? So based on everything that I've been discussing and thinking about, my answer, and I'm very much open to divergence and debate, is that it's not per se. So it's not per se a blessing, but it's not per se a curse. It is not per se unless it's coupled with a strong strategy towards diversification, technological upgrading, and learning how to learn, building a strong system of innovation, and managing to create mechanisms that maintain macroeconomic stability. So if we don't put this in the table, we are going to go to the same direction that we've seen going on in the examples that I showed you before. It could be the example of Venezuela, any other oil-based economy that's found itself closed in the development trap. So it's necessary, obviously, to do much more research on this field. Sometimes I stretch my arguments, so in order to foster the debate. But I think we need to have more research with this idea from the perspective of the South, of peripheral laggard economies, which are embedded in the international dynamics. Thank you very much, and sorry if I spoke too much, but I think I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.